Hey guys, welcome back. So today I brought home this Yamaha TTR125 LE. This is a 2015 model, and in good used condition they normally sell for about $2,500. This one I found on Facebook Marketplace for only $625, and I bet you can guess why. The engine, it blew up, and the prior owner brought it to a local shop to size up the damage, and when he got the estimate for parts and labor, he decided to sell the bike. It just wasn't worth it. In my case, the labor's free, so I'm hoping I can keep the parts cost down and make a little bit on this. Despite the engine issues, everything else on this bike seems to be there. There's no missing parts and nothing broken besides the engine. There are still a few issues. I noted that the battery had no charge in it. And this rear tire, it is bald, so both of those things do need to be replaced, but that's getting way ahead of myself. I think the priority here is sizing up the damage to the engine and just taking a closer look at the parts that I already have. So the bike came with 2 boxes of parts, as well as the brake lever, which was uninstalled. This one just has the cover for the stator and the clutch cover. I've already looked those over. They seem to be in good condition, and the hardware is there to install them. And this is probably the thing of most interest. This used to be the piston, and about 2/3 of it broke off and got consumed by the engine. So most likely we have more damage in the engine. And you can see the shiny spots on the top of that piston. That is most likely where the valves contacted that piston when it broke. Now, the valves, they don't look bent, but I do see shiny spots on either side. So we'll have to double check that. Potentially we need new valves, but I think the head is savable. The jug, on the other hand, despite the cylinder looking halfway decent, it suffered damage down here on the skirt. It is broken, so we definitely need a new one of those. So let's take a look at the engine. And the engine externally doesn't look too bad. I've looked it over pretty well, just looking for any cracks on the case, and there's nothing external indicating a problem. But even with the jug uninstalled, the engine is still locked up. I've tried rotating it without too much force, couldn't get it to move. I also tried shifting it into neutral, and I could only get 3 gears, and I never found neutral. So the transmission most likely has issues, or just pieces of that piston jammed into it. Now, the connecting rod, it's not broken, but it's bent. And that's too bad, because it actually feels pretty good on the crank. I think it would have been good otherwise. So at a minimum, we need a new connecting rod, a new pin, and a new ball bearing on the crankshaft, or just a whole new crankshaft assembly. But we really won't know how bad it is until we get this thing opened up. So that's going to be my main focus here, is just fully disassembling this engine, sizing up what we need to make this thing back 100%, and get those parts ordered. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. I think this engine might still have oil in it, so I'm going to start there. Nothing. I hope it didn't run out of oil. Yeah, this engine, it's definitely been further apart than led to believe, because the flywheel nut was loose, but the flywheel is on there pretty tight. So I think we're going to need the puller. Looks like the clutch is very loosely installed. Yeah, it looks like the basket's been off already because they did not bend this piece of metal back to hold on to that nut, so it's probably not on there very tight. That's the oil filter. Surprisingly, didn't catch any bits of the piston, although I do see one right there. There should also be a little ball in here, so you want to be sure to get that out before you lose it. Oop. And I almost lost it. You can kind of see it right there. Just going to use the kickstart mechanism to help pull this out. Like that. It's slowly coming out, but it was really tight in there. I did end up cleaning the other side with Scotch-Brite and used a bit of PB Blaster. But I think once it's out, it's going to have to be cleaned up some more before reinstalling it. Wonder if it's bent. Wow. Just a little bit bent. And pulling it through the block isn't helping the block any. So this definitely has to be replaced. If I'd realized that ahead of time, probably would have been best to just cut it off on the other side before trying to pull it out. So, yeah. I think we're just about there. It's really just getting the crankcase bolts out and splitting the case. But I think there's one behind this gear. So I'm going to pull this gear out, remove the bolts, and try to get that case open. Before I split the case, I want to test out the transmission again. And right now, I believe I have it in first gear. And if I hold the output shaft, it is spinning. I don't feel any slipping. So that seems to be good. If I move it one click, kind of in between here, that should be neutral. And the output shaft is not spinning on the back side, so that is good. Let's try second gear. Seems good. It doesn't want to go into third. All right, I think that's third. Second. And first. So, I mean, it seems like the gears are okay. I'm not so sure about the health of the shift forks, because it's not going easily from gear to gear. It's kind of getting hung up a bit, but at least there's hope. The other thing, too, is that somewhere in the disassembly, this freed up a bit. Let me get you in there closer. So it doesn't make a full revolution. I'd say about a third of the way, and then it gets stuck right there. Then when I turn it back, it gets stuck right there. So I can't see that it's hitting anything. You know, my best guess is that maybe it jumped time and it's making contact potentially with the counterbalancer. I'm not sure. My hope is that this case isn't trashed, because we already need a new or rebuilt crankshaft. That's probably the second most expensive part to this engine, just behind the crankcase. So let's get this split and see what's inside. Okay, let's give this a try. I left the oil pump gear and that shifter mechanism on the other side. I don't think they have to be removed, but I'm going to go slowly just in case I'm wrong. Doesn't look as bad as I imagined. I see bits of the piston down here, the circlip to hold the piston onto the wrist pin. Interesting that it almost rotates. So what is that getting stuck on? Crankshaft bearing feels good. So I don't think it was getting stuck on that bearing. You know what? Could have been that. Let's just try putting this back. Actually, I didn't need to put it back. I see the problem right here. There is a piece of aluminum stuck pretty good in this gear, and that's what meshes with the counterweight, and that's, I'm sure, why it wouldn't rotate. Yeah, there's little bits there. Yeah, things look pretty good. So besides the piece of metal, piece of aluminum jammed in this gear, I think this would have rotated 360 degrees. And the transmission, I don't see any broken gears. I mean, I have to look it over more closely. There is aluminum specks in there, and it's probably impossible to show you this, but I do see a big chunk of aluminum down there between the shift forks and this mechanism here for the gear selector. So that's probably why it's a little bit hard to shift, but you know, the ball bearings actually feel good on both sides of the case. So yeah, I think this one might be a survivor. I loosely put this back together. It's not timed right, but it's close enough that I can at least rotate this whole assembly, and it seems to be good. I was a little bit worried that maybe the gear on this counterweight was bent or somehow interfering with the crankshaft, but I don't think that's the case. So I think that counterweight is good. I take that back. Even though I got the crankshaft and this counterweight to spin together once I cleared the aluminum from the gear, you know, I dropped this in, spun it, and watch the top. So it is bent, and this is going to have to be replaced, which isn't a big deal. I don't think it's a high cost item. That is the piece of aluminum that was stuck between the gears and the shift forks. So yeah, that would cause an issue shifting the engine. You know, all things considered, I expected this to be a complete disaster inside of here. And really, I haven't seen anything additional that I didn't already know about. So this needs to be cleaned up really well and inspected really closely before I order any parts. But yeah, all things considered, I think I made out pretty well here. Yep. Shifts pretty good. Perfect. I want to get the transmission out so I can get a better look at the ball bearings underneath, and that'll make cleanup a lot easier. But the shift drum, it's held in on the other side just by a little Torx bolt that is Loctited in. I already tried removing it without heat and had no luck, and I really don't want to push it because I don't think I actually need to take that out. If I just remove these two shafts here that hold the forks in place, I think I should be able to lift the transmission right out. I don't know how, but all these ball bearings feel great. So kind of lucked out on that. Of course, the rest of the engine's a mess, but yeah, all things considered, I was expecting the case to be a total loss, and it's not. So that is not a bad thing. So let's take a look at the valves and see if they're straight. This head looks to be in really good shape. There's minimal carbon buildup. It looks like the valves are closed. And I don't think they're bent, because if there was a bent valve, it would be because one of the valves was open when the piston hit. But the fact that each valve has a little carbon knocked off on each side tells me that the valves were closed, and most likely they're not an issue. And really all I'm trying to find out is, at this point, is what parts do I need to order. And I don't think I need to order valves, but I am going to double check. I'm just going to take off these access covers to access the valves. I'll manually operate them, make sure they're not stuck. And then I think I'm just going to put a little PB blaster in here, let it sit for a while, and see if either of these are leaking. Intake's good. Let's try the exhaust. Yeah, they both open, so that's good. Unfortunately, I don't have the right spark plug for this. I don't even have one with those threads. The plugs I use for generators, they are much larger, and the ones I use for two-stroke are a size smaller. So yeah, I'm noticing a lot of stuff on that on the bike. I've been looking it over closely, just trying to figure out, do I really have everything? And the short answer is I have everything major, but little things, they are missing. And that's going to add up and kind of slow down this rebuild process. So anyway, I am going to plug the hole just using the compression tester adapter and a torch spark plug to kind of plug the hole. And I can screw that right in, and hopefully that'll let me fill this area up with some PB blaster and just let it sit for a bit. Okay, that should work. Well, that didn't take long. Came out the exhaust valve. Intake looks good. For the second, the PB blaster was in there. So let's get the exhaust valve out and take a closer look. In order to get that exhaust valve out, I need to get the rocker off first. And that is held in place by a pin that is more or less pressed in place. And it's kind of hard to get out without the proper tool, which I don't have in this case, but we'll see if I can come up with something. The correct tool to get this out is a threaded bolt. I think it's an M6 attached to a slide hammer to get that out. In my case, I don't have that tool, but the studs that came with the case splitter, they seem to be the right thread. So I'm going to just use, I guess to start with, a small socket and the stud and just get it started. And I think once it breaks free, it'll be a lot easier. And then I can switch to like a deep well socket to get it the rest of the way out. At least that's my hope. Yeah, it's working. So I'll switch sockets, but I think we're almost there. Yeah, potentially I need to remove the camshaft before I can get the rocker out, but I think I'll have enough clearance to get the spring compressor on there and get the valve off while leaving that camshaft in place. All right, let's see. Yep, it's bent. So I'm going to pause it here. I'm going to pull the intake out as well, and we'll have a look at that one. I think I'm going to have to buy the right tool for this one. I'm going to have to assume that the intake valve is bad as well, so I'll order a new one of those up. Really what I'm trying to do here is just size up all the parts I need to make this thing complete. And to that end, I've been looking closer at the bike just to see what else might be missing. So I got the seat and the tank off. They were not attached. And I noticed there were some missing hardware to hold the tank on and some missing bolts for the seat. So not a big deal, but that needs to get added to the list. But the thing that's been bugging me since I brought this bike home is the switch. There should be a switch right here to turn the bike on and off. You know, once you turn it on, you can then electric start the bike. And from what I can tell, that is not an optional feature. So I'm not sure where it is. You know, I haven't found any connectors for it. These two go to the stator. And on the other side, there are 3 connectors. One is for the start, one's for stop, and the other one is the clutch switch. But there should be a 4th, according to the wiring diagram, and I haven't found it yet. So I wanted to make sure that the electric start worked. So I took the battery out, connected this battery charger, one lead to the positive, and I went to touch the other one to the frame, and I was greeted by a lot of sparks. So there is a dead short. Something in this wiring harness isn't right. So I do need to figure that out before placing an order. So I'm gonna break out the multimeter and try to figure out what is going on here. So I just get this out of the way. And I'm going to set the multimeter just to test continuity so you can hear it beep when there's a connection. And I'm going to put one lead on the positive. And unless this solenoid is energized, there should not be any connection on the output, which goes to the starter motor. And there's not. Now there's 3 other wires here. One is red. That should be power out from the battery that goes up to the switch that isn't there. So that should have a connection, and it does. And then there's 2 more wires here. There's a black, which should be a ground, and this red with the white stripe should be the 12 volts coming back down when you hit the start button to energize the solenoid. But when I test it now, we get a connection as if someone's trying to start the bike. And if I check the ground wire, we also get a connection. So if I move the probe over to just a body ground and test, again, positive, get a connection, 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 connection. So there is a dead short, and I'm willing to bet it has to do with the missing switch. So let me look around a little bit. It has to be somewhere, but I have a feeling somebody jerry-rigged something. And I'm willing to bet this zip tie is hiding something, because the 4th connector is supposed to be right in this area. Instead, I see a zip tie and a wire harness that looks like it's been cut open at one point. So let's get that zip tie off and see what secrets are under there. Well, that would be a problem. The missing connector is supposed to be 4 wires, a brown, a red, a black, and a black with a white stripe. And that's exactly what this is. Why someone would cut it off instead of just unplugging it, I don't know. And why would they twist them together like that? Because the black wires, that I think will kill spark. That's the equivalent of shutting the engine off. And the red and the brown wire, I believe, would be ignition on. So if I twist those together, that should be the same as turning the key switch on. And then we'll just make sure these don't touch anything. And let's go back and test again down where the battery goes. All right, let's bump that up to 6 amps. The negative I did attach to the body of the starter, and I ran a jumper over to the frame because the starter is not making a good connection to the frame based on the fact that it's just kind of zip tied in place. But like this, with those two wires twisted together, it's essentially the same as having the switch turned on. So with the clutch depressed, or the engine in neutral, we should be able to crank. And we can. So that's good. It tells me at least the wiring harness is good. The issue was really just limited to that fault over there. And I'm just scratching my head on that one. I'm not really sure what someone was thinking, but the bike would have never run like this. So I'm guessing after the engine blew up, someone stole that switch and cut the connector off and just kind of hid what they did. Not sure. It's kind of odd. When I first brought this bike home, I was trying to figure out what led to this issue, and I had assumed that someone just rode this bike hard. They redlined the engine too often for too long, and it caused the piston to disintegrate. And that was based solely on the condition of the back tire. I mean, someone clearly had a lot of fun with this bike, but now that the engine's apart, I have changed my mind as far as how this happened. You know, the first clue is over here on this swing arm. It is quite dirty, and that dirt is stuck to the swing arm with oil. So I had assumed maybe someone got overly aggressive oiling their chain, but I just pulled the chain out of the bag, and I would say that is not the case because I don't think this chain has ever seen any oil. So the oil 100% did not come from the chain. I think it came from the engine. And as we saw earlier, this engine had no oil in it. So, you know, I wasn't the first one to get it. So maybe the guy before me drained the oil, but I don't think that's what happened because the shift shaft, as we saw, was bent. And I've actually already started cleaning this case. I wish I hadn't because it was covered in oil in this area. And clearly the oil seal for that shift shaft was leaking. And it didn't even look like it was in very well. So what I think happened is that this became bent. Someone ignored the problem. And every time they shifted the bike, it egged out this oil seal just a bit and it started leaking. And I think at some point this seal may have worked its way out and just led to the engine losing all its oil. And once that happened, the piston seized in the cylinder. And I think the piston was most likely traveling down. And when it got seized, you know, the bike was in motion, it was in gear, and the engine kept rotating. So it ripped the wrist pin out of the piston, and then the engine came around and the connecting rod jammed into that piston, bending the connecting rod and sending the piston up into the head where it was also stuck, and then the valves tried to open, bending those valves. So that's what I think happened, and it's too bad because this repair for a new oil seal and a new shift shaft would have been about $40 in parts, and instead we're looking at about $1,000 in parts, not to mention the original owner now doesn't own this bike anymore. And I would say they had a very bad day because when this engine locked up, they most likely got hurt pretty bad. Anyway, if you see a little problem, don't ignore it. And I think that's a good life lesson as well because it's easy to fix when it's a small problem. And once it becomes a big problem, yeah, it's a lot harder to fix. At this point, I think I have all the information I need. Really, I just wanted to triage the bike and the engine and get a parts list. And I have a list. It's a long list, but thankfully the transmission survived as well as the engine block. So As bad as it is, it could be worse. So I'm going to place an order. I'm sure it's going to take close to a month to get those parts. But when I do, I'm going to turn the camera back on, get that engine rebuilt, reinstalled, and hopefully fire this thing up. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching. All right, a little bit of bonus footage here. What I discovered is that the bolts that are used to hold generator stators together, like that, thread in just fine into this pin. So what I'm going to do is make my own slide hammer. You know, of course, Yamaha does sell a specialized tool to do this, but I hate buying specialized tools, especially ones that I don't know if I'm going to use again. So the plan is to use this bolt and some washers and an oversized socket as a hammer to drive that pin out. Now, initially, I was going with this approach, but it really didn't give me much space to hammer that out. So if I reverse it, then I can go the full length of the bolt and hopefully get that pin out. So let's give it a try. Well, we got the camshaft out, which, by the way, you can remove with the same method, but in this case, not needed. I think that did it. Looks like the intake valve survived. Even though the intake valve survived, I'm going to replace it anyway. They're only like 10 bucks and it's already uninstalled. Anyway, getting that pin out, that was a real struggle. It took about 30 minutes to get it out. So not really looking forward to putting the pin back in. Hopefully it's an easier process. I suspect it is. Anyway, now I'm done.